Hello, and welcome as we come now really to the mid-Sunday or the midpoint of the Lenten season. In fact, liturgically in your parishes, perhaps the vestments of the celebrant would be rose rather than violet, although that depends. And in the old days, this Sunday, which went by Latin names, was called Laetare, namely the Sunday of Rejoicing. So all of that's a little bit of an introduction to this midpoint of the Lenten season. The readings this time, first reading comes from the book of Joshua, chapter 5, verses 9a and verses 10 through 12. The second reading comes from the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 17 through 21. And the gospel comes from Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. Then it skips to verses 11 through 32. Now, in many ways, this particular section of Luke's gospel is one of the most popular and most famous. In fact, the particular story we will look at this time for our reflection has been called the story of the lost son, or the prodigal son, or the prodigal, and this is what I will make a little bit the case this time, better titled the prodigal father. Now, actually, this section begins, and that's why the opening three verses of the chapter are included before we come to the parable of the son. Begins by the fact that Jesus is arguing against a complaint made by the Pharisees and the scribes that Jesus has been welcoming sinners and those who are gatherers of taxes, we could call them tax collectors, Jesus is eating with them. And so what follows now is Jesus' response to them. We have noticed, and again, keep in mind that we are looking at this season, the gospel tradition according to Luke, that throughout this gospel, Jesus is being challenged by the scribes and the Pharisees for his teaching and for what he is doing. Also keep in mind that it's only the Pharisees apparently here who are the ones who are in positions of leadership within Jerusalem. Generally, the Pharisees in the first century world, and certainly in the time of Jesus, were not leaders. They were teachers, but they were not the leaders of the people. That belonged to the group known as the scribes and Sadducees. But here, as Luke is writing his narrative, it is the leadership characterized by the Pharisees. Now, what we find here are three parables. All having to do, and that's one way to look at it, with something which is lost. It begins with a parable about a shepherd who has 100 sheep and loses one, and goes after the lost one, brings it back, and says to the community, that would be all the fellow sheep herders, "Rejoice with me, for I have found that which was lost." This is followed by another parable about a woman who loses coins. And she searches for the coins, finds the coins, gathers together her neighbors, says, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that was lost." All right, so you have two short little parables about things that are lost. Or I don't know if a sheep is a thing, but anyway, sheep is lost, the coin is lost. Now comes the story of the prodigal. Now, in a certain way, the first two, which are not brought to our attention this time, that's why they are skipped, and they nicely fit the pattern, as we have noticed before, in Luke's gospel of having him and her stories. So you have a him story here, a shepherd who loses a sheep, a her story, a housewife who loses her coin, and both of them engage in searching, and both of them bring in for celebration a community, whether it's the other shepherds or whether it's the villagers. They are invited to rejoice, and this perhaps is one of the most important characteristics of these parables, is that they all end on a note of joy. Joy at the lost, joy at the found. All right. Well, not joy at lost, but joy that the lost are found. All right, what is the setting? Well, the setting of this gospel parable this time is that a father has two sons. And one of the sons, the younger of the sons, comes to his father at a certain point and says, "Give to me the inheritance which is mine now." Now, in a certain way, the younger son becomes kind of insulting, I suppose you could say, really to the father. "I want now what is mine when you are dead." And I kind of wish that you, does he really want his father dead? But he wants what would be his when his father died. And so the father, very graciously here, sells or gives half of his inheritance, half of what he owns, to his son. Now, it was also understood that a father could do this, and the understanding is that the father would live off of the money that was given to the son until his own leaving from this world. But that doesn't exactly seem to be what happens here. That the proceeds are given to the father, because, of course, half of the inheritance still remains with the family, and it belongs to the elder of the son. All right, so we all know pretty much the story. He takes, that is, the younger son, sells his share of the family wealth by living a kind of different way of life. And by the way, this infuriates the villages of where he comes from, because he is showing here a great dishonor to his father. And keep in mind that throughout the stories that are remembered in the gospel, honor is certainly one of the values that was generally appreciated and understood by the Mediterranean world. And shame was the thing that, dishonor was the thing you didn't want to do. What happens as the story unfolds is that the young man loses his money to non-Judeans, okay? Now, through wasteful spending. We don't know what he did. We don't know why he lost his inheritance. We do seem to think that he went outside of the territory of the Judeans, therefore would enter into the world from the Jewish point of view would be the Gentiles. He loses everything, and in fact is reduced to a status rather of almost nothing. In fact, he gets a job, and of course you have to be Jewish to appreciate this. He gets a job finally of taking care of swine or pigs, and he feeds them, and he gets to be so hungry that he would eat the pods that were being fed to the swine, except that he was, no one asked him to. Now, in case you're interested, these carob, C-A-R-O-B, pods that were being fed to the pigs were bitter berries, were nauseating, and were insufficiently nourishing to humans. So when he says he would be willing to eat these pods, you see how low you really are sinking, okay? And he cannot eat, by the way, you say, well, what about the swine? Could he eat that? Well, remember, he's Jewish, and so therefore he is forbidden to eat that food because swine were on the wrong list. Remember, a meat that the Israelis could eat. So the boy, in this sense, is certainly reduced to a dangerous situation. He then, and this is where discussions take place, and we may have noticed this before, one of the ways in which we interpret this, he comes to his senses. He says, look, back in my father's house, they have enough to eat. They have plenty. I will go back and say to my father, look, I don't deserve to be your son anymore, but treat me as you would a slave. At least a servant and a slave is given something to eat, and he is willing to do this. All right? Now, does he illustrate here a practicality, which would be characteristic, you remember we said of Luke's stories, a practicality. If I go back to my father's house, I know that he will take care of a servant, and I know that he will take care of me, and I will tell him how sorry I am for what I have done, and I don't deserve to be called your son, and all of that. That's one possibility, one that's not often emphasized. What is emphasized is the other side, that he is truly sorry for what he has done. He is truly repentant, and when he says to his father, I'm sorry for all that I have done, he truly is sorrowful, repentant in his position with his father. Now you take the one that you like, and I can kind of imagine where the homily might be developed here. Why this is called the return of the prodigal son. Now, what does the father do when the son he notices is on the way back? And this is why really the central character or figure, by the way, in this story are not the sons, but is the father. And the father here acts in a totally uncharacteristic way that a father would have done in the world of the time. First of all, he's pictured as watching, searching for the coming of his son. And when he sees him, now here is where the father acts totally out of characteristic. He runs to greet his son. This is the wrong direction, the wrong action on the part of the father. He should be waiting for the son to come to him, not him going to the son. So right away, we can see, and the village, by the way, would be noticing what is happening here, okay? Lest you think that this is done very quietly and just the father and the son notices. No, the whole entourage of the village, of the plantation, notices what the father is doing. And therefore, he publicly forgives his son by kissing him. So the gesture is important to notice here. And then he says, looking at his son, bring the best robe for him. Now, what is the best robe for him would certainly be his father's robe. And by doing this, by putting this robe on his son, is guaranteeing him acceptance both by the community, particularly later on. At the end of this, we'll see at the banquet that is celebrated, he really places this son in a most significant centering place. He then puts a ring on his finger. This is the signet ring, the sign of, trust, enormous trust given by the father by giving him this son. this ring rather. Sandals. This is the sign of his being a free man. Remember that slaves often did not wear shoes or did not wear sandals, but by giving his son one, he is indeed indicating his freedom, that he is not to be treated as a slave. And of course, killing the calf. Now we've noticed that the calf is going to, when you kill it, it's going to provide enough food for the whole village. So everybody is going to be sharing in this, all right? So the calf killed would feed approximately 100 people. So you can see that this would be a grand banquet. All right, so wow, is this father, and here's the term, prodigal. Notice that he not only is forgiving, but he loads on to this young son who has returned all of the privileges, all of the honor that would belong to him if he had stayed local. And you really admire, do we not, the father, what kindness he is showing to this son. Now, the story continues. You remember that this is the story of two sons, and as it continues, the older son is coming in from doing the tasks of the day, and he says to one of the servants, "Look, there's celebration going on up at the house. What's happening here?" And the servant says, "Well, your brother has returned home, and your father is celebrating his return with the village." Now, the elder son is hardly happy about this, as you know. Instead, he protests as inappropriate what is going on. After all, this is the son who has turned on his father by leaving, and now the father is giving him honor and praise. He said, "I want nothing to do with this. I'm not going up there." Well, the father hears that the elder son is not coming, and notice again, he goes out to his elder son. Now, in both cases, notice it is the father who has taken the direction in this gospel, which likes little journeys. So the father has taken the journey to the younger son. Now he takes the journey to the elder son. Now you could say it's not a long journey, but it isn't. But nevertheless, it fits, does it nicely, the pattern that Luke has developed here. The other son, well, he too, if the younger son had insulted his father, he also insults his father by accusing him of bringing back this guy, this son, and he doesn't even speak about him as a brother. Notice that he avoids that. So even some of the language or terminology here is kind of interesting. And he accuses his father of favoritism. Don't we always like this one? Of favoritism. He said, "Look, this son of yours comes back, and you have the calf killed and a wonderful banquet for everybody. And I, who stayed loyal to you all this time, never even gave me and my friends a goat." All right. And I noticed that goats in Scripture generally come out on the wrong side of things. Why that happens, we're not always so sure. And then he not only accuses, as I say, the father playing favoritism, he refuses to acknowledge his brother, and he even invents claims about this brother who has spent his time with harlots, with prostitutes. You welcome him and make him a part of the family. He who brought this honor, and now you bring him into the family structure. Now, clearly, we have no indication that the younger son engaged in that kind of activity, and so this would be, on the part of his brother, a kind of invention. But you like it, doesn't it? Because it's the kind of thing that captures imagination even then, and I suspect even now. So, but the Father then says to the Son, look, he was your brother, he is your brother, he has changed his mind, he has returned. We should, and the Father gets inclusive here, we should be welcoming your brother back to the family. After all, he has made mistakes, but now, in effect, has changed them. Well, we don't know, and really, interestingly, it ends on that note. We really do not know in this story what the elder son does. We don't know whether he indeed listens to his father, kind of honors what his father has asked him to do, and returns and helps complete the family again, or whether he remains in his obstinate position and chooses not to have anything to do with what the Father has done. That's why this is an excellent example of the kind of parables that were frequently used in the first century world and that Jesus used. Parables, as you remember, often and regularly good ones ended not by giving an answer, but by raising really a question, asking the audience, asking the hearers to have to think themselves. Perhaps what would they do? What would you do if you were the elder son and knew all that had happened prior to this, and knew even the fact that you had remained, and this is what the elder son had said to his father, loyal and faithful throughout the years. We're not sure rather how long the younger son was gone, but there was some time framing for him to go through everything and to be reduced to the condition that he was, and that there was a famine that had struck the place where he was, and so that would indicate that there was some period of time between the decision to share the wealth of the father and the now return stories. So, what would you do, I suppose, is what the parable asks the hearers. Clearly, it is a sort of an attack, as I mentioned at the beginning here, against the Pharisees and the scribes, who at this time should have been and were the leaders of the Judaic people. Now, who is the hero of this particular parable? And many point out that perhaps the Father is illustrative of God. God is this generous forgiver who holds not wrongs against others, who wishes them no harm, but wishes union, communion, union together, and that the scribes and Pharisees, who were not the kind of leaders they could be, that the leaders within the Christian community would be those kind of, illustrate rather, those kinds of quality. So certainly I suggested at the beginning and suggest now, maybe the best title for this would be The Prodigal Father. Prodigal here means wasteful. Was the son wasteful? The younger son, yes. Was the older son wasteful? Well, I don't know, There's some way I suppose you could make the case, but if we're dealing with material things, no, he wasn't. Was the father wasteful with his things, with his generosity, with his forgiveness, with his wanting to keep the family once again reconciled and together? Well, I don't know if that's wasteful, but that is certainly most generous. Some have pointed out here, just as we come to conclusion, and I do have to pass over very quickly, I suppose I should go back to this, that the first reading comes from the book of Joshua and illustrates the idea of the Jewish Passover as a festival. Now, in fact, the official Passover is described 6 times in the Old Testament. This is the third, this section in Joshua, the third in which this is done. And again, the celebration of the Passover here is pictured as being celebrated by the community in the land of Canaan, which, of course, is the promised land. Joshua has brought them in, and after their 40 long years of wandering in the wilderness, it's interesting here because no lamb is mentioned, so therefore this would probably be better known as the Festival of the Unleavened Bread. Later on, but when in Jewish life this took place, they would integrate the offering of the meat of the lamb with the offering of the unleavened bread for making the Passover celebration took place. Smile here, because the Feast of the Unleavened Bread was celebrated on the 14th of the month of Nisan. The lamb on the 14th, the unleavened bread on the 15th of Nisan, and so they were joined, and that's when the Passover feast is observed. Now, it also mentions in the reading that we'll hear that they planted grain. Now, where did the grain come from? Was it grain that they brought with them through those 40 years of wilderness time? Was the grain that they used something that the Canaanites had already grown and that the Canaanites were willing to share with the Israelites? Or did the Israelites take the grain from the Canaanites? So you can kind of figure that one out. As I say, if you go deeper into some of these stories, there's a lot of interesting questions that emerge. The celebration is pictured as taking place at Gilgal, and it was there that they put an altar and put a circle of stones around it. Archaeologists have kind of discovered this. A circle of stones, something like Stonehenge that are found in England, but here it is done in a very designated pattern. How many stones there were? Some say 7, some say 12. 12 would have been the number, of course, one for each of the sons of Jacob, or one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, all right? And when was this celebration done? As best we can figure it on the calendar, sometime in the month of March, April. So in that sense, that's why Passover, even to this time, is celebrated then. Well, back to quickly the story of the gospel today. I mentioned that there was a second parable there, known as the lost coin, but some also may point out it was the parable of the diligent housekeeper. Ladies have interpreted this, and I like that kind of title a little bit. In this whole section, by the way, 32 verses make up these 3 parables. Only 3 of them center on female characters. Now, there's a whole discussion that goes on that. We don't, if you're interested in that, kind of check it out, because, and we will notice in upcoming discussions, the importance of women in the story of Jesus as Luke remembers it. But this time, we conclude with the generosity of God, which knows no limits, and this helps us celebrate joyfully this middle Sunday, middle week of the Lenten time. Glad to have you with us. Thank you.